Chapter 10 of In Kent with Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. In Kent with Charles Dickens by Thomas Frost. Chapter 10. Rising early on the following morning, the curate and I walked down to the beach, where we found upon the shingle a wounded and disabled seagull, several of whose kind were skimming the sea, and ever and anon dipping the tips of their wings into the pea-green waves. The fierceness of the wounded bird, which prompted it to snap at the curate's stick, prevented anything being done for its relief, if indeed anything could have been done, one of its wings being broken, so that we were constrained to place it in a sheltered position among the black piles of the jetty, and leave it where it was at least concealed from beach boys and cockney excursionists of stone-throwing propensities. Having got up formidable appetites during a walk along the beach overhung by the east cliff, where enormous masses of chalk attest the ravages of the abrading forces of nature upon the face of the towering precipice, we rejoined our friend at the breakfast table. That important meal disposed of in a satisfactory manner, we all ascended the castled height, and saw the deep well that supplies the garrison with water, the remains of the Roman pharos, from which soldiers were carrying coal in baskets, Wellington's bedroom, remarkable for nothing but its Spartan-like absence of the remotest indication of luxury, but nothing that pleased me so much as the fine panorama presented by the old town lying below us, dimly seen through a grey veil of mist, the green ridge of the opposite heights rising above it, the furrowed expanse of greyish-green sea on the left, bounded at one point of the horizon by the thin white line of cliff between Calais and Boulogne, and the varied view inland on the right, where the greens faded into blues as the eye gazed farther northward, with a grey church tower or spire rising here and there from embosoming woods. There was not much in the way of Dickensian notabilia to look up in Dover, but we saw the house in Camden Crescent, where the novelist stayed in 1852 from July to October, and the building in which he gave one of his popular readings in 1861, concerning which he wrote to Mrs. Alfred Dickens, his brother's widow, who was then staying at Gad's Hill Place. At Dover they wouldn't go, but sat applauding like mad. The most delicate audience I have seen in any provincial place is Canterbury, but the audience with the greatest sense of humour certainly is Dover. In the afternoon we visited the ruins of St. Martin's Priory, a venerable and moss-grown remnant of the early part of the 12th century. One of the gateways was almost entire, but time had made wreck and ruin of every other portion of the building. Succeeding generations have little respect for the works of their ancestors which have ceased to serve the purposes of their foundation. In the morning we had seen an undoubted relic of the Roman occupation used as a coal-house. Here we saw a portion of a monastic edifice of the Anglo-Norman period converted into a cart-shed. The curate was grieved by the condition in which we found the ruins, but has since been comforted by the restoration of the refectory, which is now used as a schoolroom. My friends and I parted company in the evening, and I started alone for Deal, they accompanying me about a mile on the way over the east cliff. My original intention had been to walk along the beach, but I was warned that I might experience some difficulty in rounding the South Foreland from the springs of fresh water which there gush up through the shingle, and I knew by experience that the shingle beaches of this part of the coast are very unpleasant to walk upon. This route is, moreover, only practicable at low water, and, as the cliffs are in some places 400 feet high, it is not altogether free from danger. Passing on the right a signal-house, and then the lighthouse on the summit of the South Foreland, I presently reached the little village of St. Margaret's, perched on the green eminence above that lofty and almost perpendicular promontory. There the picturesque little Norman church attracted my attention for a while, and then I tramped on again over the cliffs, the way gradually sloping downward towards the north. For more than half an hour the only building which I passed was an old signal house on the cliff, and the only living creatures that I saw were the white-winged gulls which circled and screamed, now above the cliff, now below its edge, and then skimming the waves, and some Sussex cows who were quietly ruminating or cropping the short grass. It was growing dusk when I reached the hamlet of Kingsdown, where the long wall of chalk sinks into the shingle, and struck into a footpath across the fields to the village of Warmer. About 20 minutes' walking from that place took me to Deal, where I lighted my pipe at the White Horse and smoked it on the jetty, looking across the downs at the many lights that shone there like marine glow-worms, and thinking of the many tales of shipwreck and disaster associated with the long ridge of sand. Where oft by mariners is shown, unless the men of Kent are liars, Earl Godwin's castle overthrown, and palace roofs and churches' spires. The legend which connects Earl Godwin with these sands is, that they were formerly a beautiful island, on which that powerful noble had a palatial mansion. One night, as the story runs, the strong east wind which had been blowing during the day rose to a fearful gale, and the sea ran so high that the waves broke over the coast like a cataract, to the dismay of the inhabitants of Deal and Sandwich, whose homes they invaded and wrecked. For several days the storm continued with unabated fury, and the waves cast upon the beach piles of timber, broken furniture, trees torn up by the roots, and other indications of a terrible catastrophe. Nothing could be seen seaward but the wild waves and the storm-driven masses of cloud, and it was thought that the darkness caused by the intervention of the black storm-cloud and the torrents of rain that were falling obscured Godwin's Island from view. But when the storm at length abated, the island had disappeared, and the sole vestige of its existence was a strip of sand which became visible at low water. Sir Charles Lyell, having found a stratum of blue clay at the depth of 15 feet below the surface of the sand, thought that there might once have been an island where the Goodwin Sand now stretches, and that it might have been swept away by the great storm of 1099, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The sands do not appear to have attracted much attention, however, until the reign of Henry VIII, when the silting up of Sandwich Harbour by the accumulation of sand caused Sir Thomas More to be appointed a special commissioner for the investigation of the cause. "Thither," says Bishop Latimer, in one of his quaint sermons, "thither cometh Master More, and calleth the country before him such as were thought to be men of experience, and men that could of likelihood best certify him of that matter concerning the stopping of Sandwich Haven. Among others came in before him an old man with a white head, and one that was thought to be little less than 100 years old. When Master More saw this aged man, he thought it expedient to hear him say his mind in this matter, for, being so old a man, it was likely that he knew most of any man in that presence and company. So Master More called this old aged man unto him, and said, Father, tell me, if ye can, what is the cause of this great rising of the sands and shelves here about this haven, the which stop it up, so that no ships can arrive here? Ye are the oldest man that we can espy in all this company, so that if any man can tell any cause of it, ye of likelihood can say most of it, or at leastwise more than any man here assembled. Yea, forsooth, good master, quoth this old man, for I am nigh 100 years old, and no man here in this company near unto my age. Well then, quoth Master More, how say you in this matter? What think you to be the cause of these shelves and flats that stop up Sandwich Haven? Forsooth, sir, quoth he, I am an old man, and I may remember the building of Tenderden steeple, and I may remember when there was no steeple at all there. and before that Tenterden steeple was in building there was no manner of speaking of any flats or sands that stopped the haven, and therefore I think that Tenterden steeple is the cause of the destroying and decay of Sandwich Haven. And so to my purpose, preaching of God's word is the cause of rebellion, as Tenterden steeple was the cause that Sandwich Haven is decayed. The old man's theory that Tenterden steeple was the cause of the accumulation of sand along this part of the coast has been thought by some to have been not altogether groundless, though the manner in which he set it forth made it seem so extravagant and far-fetched that it has become a proverbial illustration of the ascription of effects to the wrong causes. The tower of Tenterden church was built in the reign of Henry VI., the funds for the purpose being obtained, it is said, by diverting from their proper purposes certain revenues which had been appropriated to the maintenance of a sea wall, the decay of which in consequence caused the sand to accumulate until it prevented vessels from reaching Sandwich. In the saying which thence arose, that Tenterden steeple was the cause of the Goodwin sand, there seems, however, to be a confounding of that shoal with the Sandwich flats, through which runs the channel of the river Stour, by which Sandwich is approached from the sea. Deal, though it has something of the aspect of an old town, has grown up in comparatively modern times, from the contiguity of the Downs and the concourse of vessels there. The original village of Deal is that now called Upper Deal, about a mile inland, where is the parish church, containing some fragments of Norman architecture. Brayley says that a house on the west side of Lower Street, then the farthest from the sea, was described in a deed dated 1624 as "abutting on the sea bank," and in a chancery suit tried 40 years later, a witness 72 years of age stated that he knew the site of Lower Deal before a single house was built there. Deal is the scene, in part, of the strange narrative of Ambrose Gwinett, who is said to have been hanged and gibbeted, and to have been removed alive from the gibbet, and afterwards to have lived many years, and encountered adventures and vicissitudes which might convince us that truth is stranger than fiction, if we could be sure that the story is not itself a fiction. I read the narrative when a very small boy, and have since seen a copy of the first edition, which, in the catalogue of the British Museum Library, bears the conjectural date of 1731. There is no date on the title page of the book, which is in pamphlet form, and has an engraved frontispiece representing two of the most striking scenes of the hero's strange story. It is written in the first person, and purports to be the life and strange adventures and voyages of Ambrose Gwinett, well known in London as the lame beggar who swept the crossing at the Mews Gate at Charing Cross. The narrator tells us that he was born in Canterbury, and articled to an attorney there, and in 1709, being then in his 22nd year, he left home to visit a married sister, who lived 3 miles beyond Deal. On reaching that place, however, he was so much fatigued that he lodged for the night at a public house near the beach, intending to reach his brother-in-law's house in time for breakfast. In the same room slept a man named Collins. During the night, Gwinett had occasion to go downstairs, and having some difficulty in opening a door, forced up the latch with the blade of a clasp-knife, which he afterwards dropped, and was unable in the darkness to find. In the morning Collins was missing, the sheets of his bed were stained with blood, and similar suggestions of violence were traced from the chamber to the yard, where Gwinett's knife was found. The latter was thereupon accused of having murdered his fellow lodger, whose corpse he was supposed to have thrown into the sea. He was taken before a magistrate, committed to the county gaol, tried and convicted at the next assizes, and sentenced to be hanged, which in those days involved the subsequent exposure of the corpse upon a gibbet. The first part of the sentence was executed at Deal, before the public house in which the murder was alleged to have been committed. but owing to a violent storm with torrents of rain, he was removed prematurely from the gallows, placed in a cart, and driven rapidly to the village in which his sister lived, probably Ringwold, if there is any truth in the story, and there suspended in irons from a gibbet which had been erected on a piece of waste land on which his brother-in-law's cows were grazing. He had been insensible from the moment when the noose tightened about his throat, but after the hangman and his assistant had driven away from the gibbet, he revived, his neck having escaped dislocation, and suffocation having been prevented by the hasty manner in which, owing to the storm, the sentence of the law had been imperfectly executed. In the evening, a boy who came to the spot to drive home the cows discovered that he was alive, and no time was lost by his relatives and their friends in removing him from the gibbet and taking measures for his complete resuscitation. Fearing to remain in England, he volunteered aboard a privateer, which was captured by a Spanish cruiser and taken to Havana. There he remained in prison 3 years, and by a strange coincidence met the man whom he was supposed to have murdered. Collins had been bled the day before his supposed murder, and at night, during the absence of Gwinett from the chamber, he found that the bandage had slipped from his arm, from which the blood was again flowing. He rose immediately, and was crossing the street to the house of the barber by whom the operation had been performed, when he was seized by a press-gang, and taken aboard a vessel lying in the Downs. He and Gwinett left Havana in company, but parted on the voyage, and the latter, after many adventures and vicissitudes, including captivity in Algeria, returned to England in 1730. The story, though told very circumstantially and with an air of truth, is so improbable in its chief incidents that it may fairly be doubted whether it is anything more than a successful example of the art in which Defoe excelled, of forging the handwriting of nature. It is inconceivable that in the last century a jury could convict an accused person of murder when there was no proof that the crime had been committed. That we should look in vain for evidence of the story in the newspapers of the period is less surprising than evidence of such a conviction would be, for little provincial intelligence appeared in the columns of London newspapers a century and a half ago, and Kentish journals were not yet in existence. But besides the difficulty which most minds must experience in believing that a man can have been convicted of murdering a person who, for any evidence to the contrary, was living, it must be regarded as a circumstance not in favour of the authenticity of the story that the narrator mentions neither the sign of the house in Deal at which he lodged, nor the name of the village in which his sister lived, and as another, that he should have returned to England without any evidence of his innocence of the crime of which he had been convicted, and the penalty of which still hung over his head. To me, it seems far less probable that the story should be true than that it should have been concocted as a literary speculation by a writer tolerably skilled in the art of making fiction seem like truth. Though written in the form of an autobiography, it is attributed by the compilers of the British Museum Catalogue to Isaac Bickerstaffe, upon what authority is known only to the gentlemen who perform that very useful work. What Isaac Bickerstaffe is this? Biographical dictionaries mention only one author of that name, the lyric dramatist, who, having been born 4 years subsequently to the date given in the Museum Catalogue as that of the publication of the story of Ambrose Gwinett, cannot have been the author of that strange production. The only other Isaac Bickerstaffe mentioned in the records of literary enterprise is usually regarded as an unreal person invented by Swift, whose creation is said to have afterwards been availed of by Steele for a like purpose. Mr. Robert Chambers, writing about the Tatler, says that, "At first the author endeavoured to conceal himself under the fictitious name of Isaac Bickerstaffe, which he borrowed from a pamphlet by Swift." The brochure referred to is Predictions for the Year 1708, by Isaac Bickerstaffe, Esquire. But how did it happen that both Swift and Steele, writing within a year, used the same nom de plume? Is it certain that there was not a real Isaac Bickerstaffe who might have been concerned in the literary speculations of both authors? May not the author of Ambrose Gwinett have been a son of the author of Love in a Village? However this may have been, it is certain that the latter cannot have been the author of the former work, and nearly as certain that there must have been another writer of that name whom literary research has failed to discover. He was probably a Grub Street hack, who would write the story for a guinea, or, for the same honorarium, produce a pamphlet to be published with the name of some peer or MP on the title page, and he may have lent his name to Swift and Steele for some such consideration, and allowed them afterwards to treat him as a non-existent person, as much a being of Steele's creation as Nestor Ironside. If it be asked why Steele should have borrowed Bickerstaff's name, if there really was such a person, when he might have written anonymously or with a fictitious name, the obvious answer is, that either Steele or Swift, if not both, did do so, and that speculation as to the motive would, at this date, be vain. It is possible, of course, that Steele was unaware of Bickerstaff's existence, and borrowed the name from the title page of Swift's pamphlet, as stated by Mr. Robert Chambers and others. But it is much more probable that Bickerstaffe was known to Steele than that, being known to Swift, he should have been unknown to the former, who, besides being a lounger about town and a frequenter of the coffee-houses, was at that time on terms of intimacy with Swift. I thought of the strange story of the deal of a century and a half ago, the deal of the smugglers and the preventive service men, the press gangs and the privateers, as I turned up from the beach, and wondered which of the older public houses, if either, had been the scene of the supposed murder and of Gwinett's semi-execution. Was it the North Star, or the Deal Cutter, or the Rose and Crown, or the Three Compasses? I could not decide. I know it was the custom in those days to execute murderers on the scene of their crime, but I could not imagine an execution in one of those narrow streets. The gallows could not have been set up on the beach, for we are told that it was opposite the public house, opposite to which was also the barber's shop, to which Collins was bound when he encountered the press gang. I gave it up. End of chapter 10.